September 1st, 1943, the tropical heat pressed down on Rabaul Airfield, New Britain, as Lieutenant Commander Saburo Sakai reviewed the latest intelligence report. His remaining eye, the left one lost to American gunners a year prior, scanned words that brought an involuntary smile to his weathered face. The Americans had unveiled their newest creation, a fighter they called the Hellcat. According to the documents spread before him, this machine weighed nearly as much as a medium bomber, with wings broader than a transport aircraft. Intelligence estimates suggested it carried twice the weight of Japan's legendary Zero. Another example, Sakai thought, of American engineering excess. Power without precision, weight without wisdom. Through the tense opening, he observed his squadron's A-60s lined perfectly along the steel planking. Each aircraft represented the pinnacle of fighter design, sleek, nimble, absolutely lethal. For 24 months, these machines had commanded Pacific skies with undisputed authority. British Hurricanes had fallen. American P-40 Warhawks had been swept aside. Dutch Brewster Buffaloes had been eliminated from the aerial battlefield. This latest American attempt, this overweight Hellcat, would surely meet the same fate. What Lieutenant Commander Sakai couldn't possibly know, what none of the experienced naval aviators gathering for their morning briefing could imagine, was that within exactly 30 days, this supposed failure would begin the systematic dismantling of Japanese naval aviation. The F6F Hellcat would achieve a combat exchange ratio of 19-1, accounting for 5,223 enemy aircraft, while losing merely 270 in aerial engagements. This aircraft would transform carrier warfare, shatter the foundation of Japanese air power, and demonstrate that the Zero's reign had been constructed upon assumptions that would prove catastrophic. The mathematics of aerial supremacy were about to undergo complete revision by a fighter that appeared fundamentally flawed, handled like a freight train, and seemed to contradict every principle Japanese designers had perfected over years of refinement. Yet within half a year, the very aviators now dismissing intelligence reports would compose final letters to their families, understanding that encountering Hellcats represented statistical probability of not returning home. The confidence emanating from Japanese naval aviation in September 1943 wasn't merely pride, it was supported by mathematical evidence. Since December 7, 1941, the Imperial Japanese Naval Air Service had compiled victory ratios that seemed to defy possibility. At Pearl Harbor, they sacrificed 29 aircraft while eliminating 347. Throughout the Philippines campaign, 7 losses against 103 destroyed. Over Darwin, Australia, 2 losses versus 30 confirmed. The British Far East Fleet's air component annihilated. The Dutch East Indies Air Force removed from the equation within days. At the center of this dominance operated the Mitsubishi A6M0, an aircraft that had fundamentally rewritten fighter design philosophy. When captured examples underwent testing by American engineers in 1942, they initially questioned the validity of the performance data. A fighter possessing the range of a bomber, the maneuverability of an aerobatic biplane, and sufficient firepower to eliminate anything it intercepted, it seemed theoretically impossible. Warrant Officer Hiroyoshi Nishizawa, who would ultimately become Japan's highest-scoring ace with 87 confirmed victories, described the Zero in recovered diary entries. Operating the Zero feels like wearing wings attached to your body. The aircraft responds to intention, not merely to control inputs. American planes handle like commercial vehicles, powerful but lacking grace. They construct fighters using the same philosophy they apply to automobiles. Heavy, over-engineered, inefficient. We build aircraft that dance through the sky. The Zero achieved its remarkable performance through revolutionary design philosophy. Extra Super Duralumin, a classified aluminum alloy, created a structural framework 30% lighter than comparable American designs. No armor plating protected the pilot from enemy fire. No self-sealing fuel tanks added protective weight. Even radio equipment was frequently removed to save precious pounds. Every single ounce sacrificed at the altar of performance, agility, and range. But what no one in Japanese high command could have anticipated was that this very philosophy, this pursuit of perfection through reduction, would become their greatest vulnerability. The first intelligence assessments of the F6F Hellcat reached Japanese analysis teams through neutral Swedish channels in early 1943. The specifications appeared either as propaganda or perhaps deliberate misinformation designed to mislead Japanese strategists. The aircraft reportedly weighed 1,286 pounds when fully loaded for combat. The Zero weighed 5,800 pounds. Its wing area spanned 334 square feet, dominated by a draggy radial engine that seemed aerodynamically inefficient. It carried 2,400 rounds of ammunition, armor plating protecting every vital component, bulletproof glass, self-sealing fuel tanks holding 250 gallons. Captain Minoru Genda, the tactical genius who had meticulously planned the Pearl Harbor operation, reviewed these specifications at Combined Fleet Headquarters. His analysis, preserved in Japanese defense archives, demonstrated clear dismissal. The Americans have learned nothing from their previous defeats, he wrote. This Hellcat represents the continuation of their failed philosophy, attempting to overcome pilot skill and aircraft agility with sheer weight of machinery. A Zero will fly circles around it. Their designers understand nothing of aerial combat. The mathematics appear to support Genda's assessment completely. The Zero's wing loading of 22 pounds per square foot provided a turning radius of 612 feet, devastatingly tight. The Hellcat's wing loading of 36.5 pounds per square foot suggested a turning radius exceeding 900 feet. In turning engagements, the absolute foundation of all Japanese fighter tactics developed since the 1930s, the Hellcat would be completely helpless, a lumbering target for Zero pilots to exploit. September 30th, 1943. Marcus Island, Petty Officer First Class Yoshio Fukui provided escort for a reconnaissance mission when he spotted them, 6 dark blue shapes climbing from the southeast. His initial thought, recorded in his after-action report, medium bombers on an unusual heading, possibly lost. Then they turned and he observed the distinctive profile. Single engine, massive fuselage, wings that appeared disproportionately short for the body mass. First encounter with F6F type fighter. He documented. Initial impression, Americans have mounted fighter armament on a torpedo bomber airframe. He engaged using standard doctrine. Standard doctrine meant exploiting the Zero's superior turn rate to position behind the enemy. Fuki rolled into a diving turn, anticipating the heavy American fighter would continue straight ahead, allowing him to curve gracefully onto its vulnerable rear position. Instead, something unprecedented occurred. The Hellcat didn't attempt to flee. It didn't try to match his turn. It went vertical. The Pratt & Whitney R2800 double wasp engine, producing 2,000 horsepower, 700 more than the Zero's Nakajima Sakai engine at 1,130 horsepower, drove the Hellcat upward at 3,500 feet per minute. Fukui, attempting to follow, watched his airspeed decay rapidly as the Zero struggled against gravitational forces. At 15,000 feet, the Hellcat performed a maneuver that shouldn't have been physically possible for an aircraft of its weight. A hammerhead turn that dropped it directly onto Fukui's vulnerable tail position. The American opened fire at 400 meters, Fukui reported in his debriefing. 6 machine guns, not the 4 we had been briefed to expect. The volume of fire was unlike anything encountered previously. My aircraft sustained 17 hits in approximately 3 seconds. Only by entering a deliberate spin did I manage to escape. Fukui survived, barely making it back to Marcus Island with his Zero riddled with holes that maintenance crews counted in disbelief. His wingman, Petty Officer 2nd Class Masao, didn't return to base. Neither did the reconnaissance aircraft they had been assigned to protect. First blood to the Hellcat. The rules of engagement had just been rewritten, and Japanese tactical doctrine had become obsolete in a single 3-second burst. October 5th, 1943, Task Force 14 launched strikes against Wake Island. Lieutenant Yoshio Shiga led 12 Zeros from the 252nd Air Group to intercept what intelligence suggested was another harassment raid. American carriers had been conducting these hit-and-run operations for months, typically withdrawing before Japanese fighters could achieve full engagement. This time would be fundamentally different. We climbed to 20,000 feet, Shiga recorded in his personal diary. Below our position, 12 F6F fighters organized in 3 divisions. We held every conceivable advantage: altitude, position, surprise. Victory was absolutely certain. Our tactics had never failed. The engagement that followed shattered Japanese tactical doctrine like glass. As the Zeros dove on the Hellcats, the American fighters didn't scatter in panic or attempt to turn defensively. They maintained formation discipline, accelerating in a gentle dive that preserved their energy state. When the Zeros opened fire at maximum range, hoping for fortunate hits, the Hellcats simply absorbed the punishment without apparent effect. The Hellcat's armor included 212 pounds of steel plate protecting the pilot and 10 pounds shielding the oil system, self-sealing tanks capable of sustaining dozens of hits without catastrophic fuel loss. As the Zeros exhausted their limited ammunition and diving passes, the Hellcats executed their counterattack with mechanical precision. Instead of engaging in traditional turning dogfights, they weaponized their weight advantage. Climbing at full power, they reached altitudes where the Zero's engines struggled for oxygen. At 25,000 feet, the Hellcat still produced 1,650 horsepower. The Zero had degraded to approximately 900 horsepower, gasping for air in the thin atmosphere. They descended upon us like hawks upon sparrows, Shiga wrote in his diary that evening. Their weight advantage provided speed we couldn't possibly match. They would dive, unleash those 6 terrible guns, then climb away before we could react or maneuver. Our turning advantage meant nothing. They refused to fight our fight. 8 Zeros were lost that day over Wake Island. Not a single Hellcat failed to return to its carrier. The mathematical foundation of Japanese air superiority had just collapsed. November 11, 1943. Rabaul. The assembled pilots of the 204th Air Group listened with growing concern as Lieutenant Commander Takeo Tanemizu briefed them on American tactics. Tanemizu, with 32 confirmed victories, represented one of the few pilots who had survived multiple encounters with Hellcats and lived to share lessons learned. "Forget everything you know about air combat," he told the gathered aviators, his voice carrying unusual gravity. The Americans have changed the fundamental rules. They no longer fight our fight. They fight like executioners, not warriors. Tanamisu explained what Japanese pilots were slowly, fatally learning through combat experience paid in blood. The Hellcat wasn't designed to outturn the Zero. It was engineered to never need to engage in turning combat. Using a combat doctrine called energy fighting, Hellcat pilots maintained speed and altitude advantages, converting potential energy to kinetic energy in slashing attacks that gave Zero pilots zero opportunity to exploit their superior maneuverability. They operate in pairs, Tanamisu continued, his finger tracing patterns on the briefing board. One high, one low. While you engage one aircraft, the second is already diving on your position. Their radio equipment, which we initially mocked for adding unnecessary weight, allows them to coordinate with perfect timing. We fly as individual samurai, each pilot a lone warrior. They fight as a coordinated machine. The technology gulf revealed itself in every engagement. December 1943, Truck Lagoon. Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, who had commanded the Pearl Harbor attack strike, now served as Air Operations Officer for the combined fleet. His inspection of damaged Zeros returning from encounters with Hellcats revealed a growing technology gap that couldn't be bridged through pilot skill alone. The disparity in firepower was purely mathematical. The Hellcat's 6 Browning M2 machine guns fired 750 rounds per minute each, 4,500 rounds per minute total output. Each .50 caliber projectile weighed 46 grams and traveled at 2,900 feet per second, delivering 3,500 foot-pounds of kinetic energy per impact. The Zero's 7.7mm machine guns fired projectiles weighing merely 11 grams at 2,300 feet per second, 750 foot-pounds of energy. The difference wasn't incremental, it was categorical. More disturbing were reports of American radar-guided fighter direction, a technological capability that seemed like science fiction to Japanese aviators. While Japanese pilots still relied exclusively on eyesight to spot enemies, often at distances under 5 miles, Hellcat pilots were guided directly to their targets by shipboard radar controllers who could detect Japanese aircraft from 50 miles away. Lieutenant Sadamu Kamachi described his squadron's first radar-directed interception in his combat report. We were climbing through cloud cover when they struck us. No warning, no visual contact whatsoever. Hellcats diving from above, exactly on our heading, perfectly positioned at our altitude. They knew our precise location, our altitude, our course heading. We were blind men fighting opponents who could see in complete darkness. The pilot equation was becoming catastrophic. January 1944. The Japanese pilot crisis had evolved from concerning to catastrophic. The pre-war Imperial Navy pilot training program had been acknowledged as the world's most demanding and thorough. Training required 3 full years, with pilots entering combat operations with 700 flight hours of experience. Army pilots received a minimum of 500 hours before combat deployment. They were artists of aerial combat, trained extensively in aerobatics, gunnery, navigation, and even the spiritual philosophy of airfighting. By early 1944, the mathematics had become devastating. Japanese naval pilots were entering combat with 300 hours of flight time. Army pilots received 200 hours. Fuel shortages meant most training was conducted in gliders. Gunnery practice was limited to 50 rounds per pilot, barely enough to familiarize themselves with their weapons. Formation flying, instrument flight procedures, radio communication protocols, all eliminated from training curriculum to rush pilots to frontline units. Meanwhile, American pilots were arriving at carrier squadrons with 300 hours minimum, including 50 hours flying the specific type they would take into combat. They had fired thousands of practice rounds, practice carrier landings until the procedures became automatic muscle memory, and learned energy fighting tactics in safety over Texas training airfields. Lieutenant Commander Yoshihiro Hashimoto, training officer at Kasumigara Naval Air Station, wrote in his final report a devastating assessment. "We are sending children to fight professionals." Yesterday, Ensign Yamamoto arrived at the front, Hashimoto continued. He had never fired his guns during flight. We possess no ammunition for practice. He had never flown at night. We have no fuel allocation for such training. He lasted 7 minutes in his first combat sortie before his aircraft was struck. 7 minutes of training measured against years of American preparation. October 12th to 16th, 1944. The Battle of Formosa. Vice Admiral Shigeru Fukudome, commander of the 2nd Air Fleet, committed everything available to halt American carrier raids on Formosa. Over 700 aircraft, including the last trained pilots from Homeland Training Squadrons, essentially Japan's strategic reserve of aviation expertise. Japanese headquarters claimed spectacular victory. 26 carriers and battleships reportedly sunk, 300 aircraft destroyed. Celebrations erupted across Japanese military installations. The reality, discovered only after pilots returned and gun camera footage underwent careful development and analysis, was catastrophic beyond comprehension. Actual American losses, 89 aircraft. Japanese losses, 329 aircraft and nearly every experienced pilot who had participated. Lieutenant Sadaki Akamatsu, one of the few surviving veterans of the battle, described the engagement in his post-war memoirs with haunting clarity. The Hellcats were waiting at every altitude level. As we climbed, they positioned above us. As we dove to attack, they were somehow below. They had divided the sky into geometric grids, each section covered by a division of fighters. It was not combat in any traditional sense. It was systematic extermination, as methodical as factory work. June 19, 1944, the Philippine Sea. The Japanese Navy committed its reconstituted carrier force to Operation AGO, the decisive battle that military leadership believed would destroy American carrier power in the Pacific once and for all. 9 carriers deployed, 450 aircraft, or their best remaining pilots, carefully hoarded for this moment. Against them steamed Task Force 58, 15 American carriers and 956 aircraft, including 450 F6F Hellcats. Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa launched his strikes in 4 carefully coordinated waves, confident that remaining Japanese pilot skill and the Zero's superior range advantage would finally prevail in this decisive engagement. The first wave of 69 aircraft launched at 0830 hours. American radar detected them at 150 miles distance, almost beyond visual range for human observers. Hellcats were vectored for interception with perfect positioning achieved before the Japanese formations even approached the fleet. Altitude advantage secured, sun at their backs, approaching from Japanese blind spots. Lieutenant Zenji Abe, leading the fighter escort, saw the Hellcats minutes before engagement commenced. They were stacked from 20,000 to 30,000 feet, he recorded in his combat report. At least 60 of them, waiting like a steel curtain suspended across the sky. We were at 18,000 feet. Every conceivable advantage was theirs. We flew into a trap prepared with mathematical precision. The engagement lasted exactly 12 minutes. Of 69 Japanese aircraft in the first wave, 42 were lost. Commander David McCampbell, Commander Air Group of Air Group 15, accounted for 7 aircraft in that single engagement. His wingman, Lieutenant Roy Rushing, claimed 6 confirmations. "The Zeros attempted to turn with us," McCampbell reported in his after-action debriefing. "We simply refused to accept their terms of engagement. We would execute a high-side run, eliminate 1 aircraft, then zoom climb back to altitude advantage. They would attempt to follow, stall out due to insufficient power, and another Hellcat would eliminate them during their vulnerable moment." By day's end, the statistical reality was undeniable. The Japanese had lost 346 carrier-based aircraft, plus an additional 50 land-based aircraft committed to the battle. American losses, 30 aircraft from all causes, including operational accidents and anti-aircraft fire. The exchange ratio exceeded 10-1. American pilots in their ready rooms that evening coined a term that would enter military vocabulary: turkey shoot. The enemy aircraft had been as helpless as game birds during hunting season. October 24th, 1944, the Battle of Leyte Gulf. Commander David McCampbell would establish his single-mission record during this engagement. Leading 7 Hellcats from USS Essex, he intercepted a force of 60 Japanese aircraft heading directly for the American fleet. In the ensuing 90-minute battle, McCampbell personally accounted for 9 aircraft, 5 Zeros and 4 bombers, while his wingman, Roy Rushing, eliminated 6 more. "I expended all ammunition after the 9th confirmation," McCampbell recorded in his combat log. "The Hellcat performed flawlessly throughout the entire engagement. Not a single hit on my aircraft despite being outnumbered 8-1. The aircraft's durability and firepower made the difference between survival and loss." This engagement demonstrated the complete reversal of air superiority in the Pacific. 7 Hellcats had routed 60 Japanese aircraft, eliminating 15 without suffering a single loss. McCampbell's 2 ace-in-a-day performances, 7 confirmations on June 19th and 9 on October 24th, earned him both the Medal of Honor and Navy Cross, the highest decorations for valor America could bestow. The aftermath of the Philippine Sea and Leyte Gulf battles produced what Japanese military psychologists later termed Hellcat psychosis among surviving pilots, a psychological condition characterized by fatalism and anticipatory dread before missions. Admiral Ozawa, in his after-action report, wrote with devastating clarity, "The enemy's radar-guided fighter direction achieved something we considered impossible: the industrialization of air combat. Each Hellcat operates not as an individual fighter, but as a component in a vast interconnected system." Our pilots, regardless of skill level, were engaging not individual planes, but an entire system. The Hellcat itself is merely the weapon. The true enemy is the American industrial and technological approach to warfare. The pilot shortage had become so severe that by early 1945, training times collapsed to levels that would have been considered criminally negligent just 2 years earlier. Navy pilots received 40 to 50 hours total flight time. Army pilots received 60 to 70 hours. Kamikaze pilots, young men being sent on one-way missions, received only 40 to 50 hours of training total, approximately 7 days from civilian to combat deployment. April to June 1945, Operation Iceberg, the invasion of Okinawa. The Japanese launched 1,900 high-risk kamikaze sorties against the American fleet assembled off the island. The Hellcat's role transformed from fighter to defender against the ultimate desperation of these attacks. Lieutenant Eugene Valencia, leading his Flying Circus division of Hellcats, accounted for 23 Japanese aircraft during the campaign. His tactical innovations, using divisions of 4 aircraft Imperfectly coordinated attacks made traditional Japanese tactics virtually impossible to sustain. We developed what we called the mowing machine, Valencia explained in post-war interviews. 4 Hellcats in line abreast formation, separated by 100 yards. We would sweep through Japanese formations at high speed. Each pilot covered his designated sector. We'd make one pass, climb back to altitude advantage, and repeat the process. Systematic, efficient, devastating. The mathematics of the Okinawa campaign were stark and undeniable. Hellcats flew 138 combat sorties over the 3-month campaign, claiming 2,151 victories against 249 losses from all causes. A 9.5 to 1 ratio even under the most challenging defensive conditions imaginable. More significantly, from a strategic perspective, they prevented approximately 80% of kamikaze aircraft from reaching their intended targets, saving countless American lives aboard the vulnerable transport and supply vessels. By 1945, the technological chasm had become completely unbridgeable through any means available to Japanese industry. The F6F Hellcat incorporated improvements that made an already superior aircraft even deadlier. Water injection systems boosting power output to 2,200 horsepower. Zero-length rocket launchers for ground attack missions. Improved armor protection. The K-14 computing gun sight that automatically calculated deflection angles, making accurate shooting dramatically easier for average pilots. Lieutenant Commander Saburo Sakai, Japan's legendary ace with 28 official victories, though modern historians estimate closer to 15 confirmed, encountered Hellcats for the first time in June 1944. Despite his extensive skill and combat experience spanning years, he nearly lost his life in his first engagement with the American fighter. "I perform my absolute best aerobatics," he wrote in his autobiography years later. "Loops, rolls, split-S maneuvers, every technique I had perfected over 200 combats spanning 3 years of war." The Hellcat followed easily, almost casually, as if the pilot were merely practicing rather than fighting for his life. "I survived only because the American pilot made a tactical error. He forgot to release his external drop tank before engaging in combat, which reduced his performance advantage slightly." By war's conclusion, the F6F Hellcat had fundamentally transformed Pacific naval warfare. The statistics tell a story of complete dominance. 5,223 enemy aircraft destroyed in aerial combat. 270 Hellcats lost to enemy fighters. Achievement of a 19.3 to 1 overall exchange ratio. Production of 305 United States Navy aces. Pilots with 5 or more confirmed victories, accounting for 75% of all Navy air-to-air victories throughout the entire Pacific War. The human cost for Japan was catastrophic and irreplaceable. Of the 18,000 naval aviators who had started the war with extensive training and high skill levels, fewer than 100 combat-experienced pilots remained operational by August 1945. An entire generation of aerial warriors, carefully trained over years, had been systematically eliminated by an opponent they had initially dismissed as inferior. The transformation of Japanese naval aviation from an elite striking force to kamikaze operations represented the ultimate admission of Hellcat superiority. Unable to compete through conventional means, Japan transformed its pilots into guided projectiles. Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi, architect of the kamikaze program, justified this desperate measure with stark mathematical reasoning documented in his planning papers. If a Zero attacks a carrier using conventional tactics, probability of success approaches zero. The Hellcats will intercept and eliminate it before weapon release. If the zero becomes a guided bomb, probability of striking the target increases to 30%. The pilot faces the same outcome either way. At least as a special attack pilot, his sacrifice has strategic meaning and honors his family. On October 25, 1944, Hiroyoshi Nishizawa escorted the first official kamikaze mission, led by Lieutenant Yukio Seki. During this mission, Nishizawa claimed his 86th and 87th victories. 2 F6F Hellcats engaged during the escort duty. The next day, October 26, 1944, Nishizawa perished as a passenger aboard a transport aircraft struck by Hellcats from Fighter Squadron VF-14. Japan's greatest ace, rendered helpless without a fighter to command, fell victim to the very aircraft he had briefly managed to best in combat. August 15, 1945, Emperor Hirohito's surrender broadcast. At Atsugi Airfield, Captain Minoru Genda, who had dismissed the Hellcat as weight over finesse 3 years earlier, listened to the Emperor's words announcing Japan's surrender. Around him sat the remnants of Japanese naval aviation, teenage pilots with 40 hours of flight time, aircraft assembled from salvage parts, empty fuel storage tanks. The dream of aerial supremacy had evaporated like morning mist. That same day, Ensign Clarence Moore of Fighter Squadron VF-31, flying from USS Belleau Wood, intercepted a Yokosuka D-4Y Judy dive bomber after 2:01 p.m. The Japanese pilot, apparently unaware of the surrender announcement or choosing to ignore it, was approaching the American fleet when Moore intercepted. 2 short bursts from the Hellcat's 6 guns ended the Pacific Air War. The last shots fired in anger after years of conflict. September 1945, Atsugi Airfield during occupation. The first American aircraft to land after the formal surrender were 12 F6F Hellcats from USS Yorktown. Japanese pilots, mechanics, and ground crew personnel lined the runway to observe their tormentor up close for the first time. American pilot Lieutenant Robert Vasu, an ace with 19 confirmed victories, demonstrated the Hellcat's capabilities to assemble Japanese pilots. His casual aerobatics, loops, rolls, and climbs that would have torn a Zero's lightweight structure apart left them speechless. "You have to understand something," Vasu told them through an interpreter, his tone professional rather than boastful. "This isn't even pushing the aircraft to its limits. In actual combat with water injection engaged, it produces 20% more power than what you're observing. The airframe is stressed for 13 G-forces. I've never managed to break one through maneuvering, no matter how hard I've tried." Japanese engineers studying captured Hellcats after the war discovered the true extent of American industrial superiority that had been hidden behind combat statistics. The Pratt & Whitney R2800 engine contained 2,804 precision machine components, each completely interchangeable with any other R2800 engine produced anywhere in America. Standardization at a level that seemed impossible. The Nakajima Sakai engine required hand-fitting of components during assembly. No 2 engines were exactly identical, requiring specialized maintenance knowledge for each individual power plant. Professor Jiro Horikoshi, designer of the legendary Zero, studied the Hellcat extensively in the post-war period. His conclusion, published in his technical memoirs, was devastating in its honesty. "We designed an aircraft optimized for 1941 conditions. They designed an aircraft system optimized for 1945 realities. While we were perfecting the sword, attempting to achieve martial perfection, they were constructing the industrial age. We never understood we were fighting different wars." Grumman's production of the Hellcat itself became a strategic weapon as significant as the aircraft's combat capabilities. The Bethpage, New York factory operated 24 hours daily, 7 days weekly, without interruption. At peak production efficiency, a new Hellcat rolled off the assembly line every 60 minutes, one complete fighter aircraft per hour. The company produced 12,175 Hellcats in just 30 months of production, a manufacturing feat the Japanese couldn't comprehend given their industrial limitations. In 1944 alone, Japan produced 5,100 fighters of all types combined, straining every available resource. America produced 35,000 fighters that same year, nearly 7 times Japanese output. The production system included innovations that seemed impossible to Japanese observers studying it after the war. Workers utilizing color-coded instruction systems to assemble complex components without extensive training. Multiple shifts operating continuously around the clock. Quality control maintaining standards despite unprecedented speed. The Hellcat didn't merely win individual battles. It revolutionized the fundamental nature of naval warfare. Pre-war doctrine assumed aircraft carriers were vulnerable platforms that needed to strike first to achieve survival. The Hellcat inverted this assumption completely. Carriers became mobile fortresses, capable of absorbing and repelling any air attack through sheer defensive fighter capability. Admiral Mark Mitcher, commander of Task Force 58, understood this transformation with perfect clarity. With the Hellcat providing defensive umbrella, we don't need to locate them first. Let them come to us. The F6F will eliminate them at our convenience, on our terms. This confidence enabled unprecedented offensive operations. American carriers could position themselves off enemy coastlines for weeks at a time, their Hellcat protective coverage making them essentially invulnerable to conventional air attack. Beyond pure technology, the Hellcat represented a cultural philosophy that invalidated Japanese military doctrine at its foundation. The samurai tradition emphasized individual excellence, spiritual strength, and acceptance of fate. The Hellcat embodied systematic efficiency, material superiority, and preservation of warrior life as a valuable resource. This philosophical chasm meant Japanese pilots couldn't adapt to Hellcat tactics even when they intellectually understood them. The concept of refusing combat when tactically disadvantaged, fundamental to Hellcat doctrine, was literally unthinkable to Japanese pilots trained in Bushido warrior code. Honor demanded engagement regardless of circumstances. The Hellcat's philosophy was pragmatic. Survive, maintain advantage, strike when conditions favor success. Two incompatible worldviews colliding in the skies above the Pacific. In 1962, the United States Navy convened a symposium on Pacific War aviation at the Naval War College. American and Japanese veterans gathered to discuss the conflict with the perspective that only historical distance provides. Captain David McCampbell, the Navy's ace of aces with 34 confirmed victories, stated with simple directness, "The Hellcat won the Pacific Air War, period. No other single factor contributed more significantly. It systematically eliminated Japanese aviation and made our ultimate victory mathematically inevitable." Commander Saburo Sakai, attending as an honored guest, responded with equal honesty, "The Zero was a superior fighter aircraft in terms of pure flight characteristics. The Hellcat was a superior weapon system in terms of warfare capability. We never understood the fundamental difference until far too late to matter. We brought swords to a gunfight and wondered why we suffered defeat. The Hellcat's dominance can be reduced to simple mathematics that tell a profound story about industrial warfare. Overall exchange ratio, 19-1. Specifically against Zeros, the ratio was 13-1. Hellcats produced 275 in 30 months. Zeros produced from 1943 to 1945, approximately 6,000. American pilots trained on Hellcats, over 5,000. Japanese pilots remaining by August 1945 with combat capability, fewer than 100. Admiral Jizaburo Ozawa, who had commanded the Japanese fleet during the catastrophic Battle of the Philippine Sea, provided perhaps the most brutally honest assessment in his post-war writings. "We laughed at the Hellcat initially because we fundamentally didn't understand it, represented not merely an aircraft design, but an entire civilization's approach to warfare. Industrial, systematic, pragmatic. By the time we stopped laughing and began understanding, our air forces had effectively ceased to exist as a fighting force." Lieutenant Commander Saburo Sakai lived until the year 2000, surviving the war by 55 years. In his final recorded interview, conducted just months before his passing, he was asked about the Hellcat and its impact on the war. His response captured the totality of its dominance with poetic simplicity. "The Zero made Japan believe it was a great naval power, capable of challenging any opponent. The Hellcat made Japan realize it had never been as formidable as it believed. We thought we were samurai warriors, the best individual fighters in the world. The Hellcat showed us we were merely men with outdated weapons and obsolete tactics facing the future of warfare. Every Japanese pilot who survived the war did so because a Hellcat pilot chose to let them live, either through mercy or circumstance. That is the ultimate defeat, existing only at your enemy's discretion, knowing you survived not through your own skill, but through their choice." The F6F Hellcat entered service weighing twice what the Zero weighed. Carrying armor protection the Zero didn't incorporate. Powered by an engine the Japanese couldn't manufacture with their available technology and resources. Armed with weapons they couldn't match in volume or effectiveness. Guided by radar systems they couldn't detect or counter. Flown by pilots they couldn't equal in systematic training. Produced in numbers they couldn't comprehend, given their industrial limitations. Japanese pilots had laughed at it during those first intelligence briefings because they didn't understand that every extra pound represented not weakness or poor design, but rather the strength of an industrial democracy that could afford to protect its warriors. By the time they understood this fundamental truth, their laughter had transformed to final letters home. Their mockery had evolved into desperate special attack missions. Their confidence had collapsed into complete defeat. The Hellcat hadn't merely overcome the Zero in tactical combat. It had destroyed an entire philosophy of warfare, proving conclusively that in modern industrial conflict, the nation capable of building the superior system would systematically eliminate the nation that could only produce superior individual warriors. Technology, industrial capacity, systematic training, tactical doctrine, all mattered more than individual courage or aircraft agility. The human stories behind these statistics deserve remembrance. Young men on both sides, some barely out of their teenage years, climbed into cockpits knowing they might not return. American pilots who trusted their Hellcats to bring them home safely. Japanese pilots who flew aircraft that offered them virtually no protection, their survival depending solely on skill and fortune. The courage displayed by warriors on both sides merits eternal respect, regardless of which nation they served. These weren't merely machines engaging in abstract aerial combat. They were young men, sons, brothers, fathers, fighting for their nations in a conflict that would reshape the world. The Hellcat's technical superiority doesn't diminish the bravery of Japanese pilots who continued fighting against impossible odds. Their determination, even in the face of certain defeat, speaks to the human spirit's resilience. The veterans who survived carried these memories throughout their lives. Many formed friendships across former battle lines in later years, discovering they had more in common as warriors than the conflicts that had divided them. They understood what civilians never could: the terror and exhilaration of aerial combat, the weight of survival when comrades didn't return, the complex emotions of victory mixed with loss. The technological lessons learned during this period fundamentally shaped modern aviation. The Hellcat's emphasis on pilot protection influenced every fighter design that followed. The understanding that industrial capacity matters as much as individual aircraft performance revolutionized military planning. The recognition that systematic training produces better results than limited time with gifted individuals transformed pilot education worldwide. Today, aviation museums around the world preserve both Hellcats and Zeros, standing side by side as reminders of this pivotal chapter in history. Visitors can observe the stark differences: the Hellcat's robust construction versus the Zero's elegant lightness. These preserved aircraft serve as three-dimensional history lessons, teaching new generations about the period when aerial warfare came of age. The engineering innovations pioneered in the Hellcat influenced commercial aviation development for decades. Reliable radial engines, robust construction techniques, systematic quality control. These wartime necessities became peacetime advantages as aviation transitioned from military to civilian application. The thousands of engineers and workers who built Hellcats went on to careers in aerospace, carrying lessons learned into the jet age. The strategic implications extended far beyond the Pacific War. The Hellcat demonstrated that carrier-based aviation could achieve air superiority, fundamentally changing naval doctrine worldwide. Post-war carrier development by multiple nations reflected lessons learned from Hellcat operations. The concept of the carrier battle group, with fighters providing defensive umbrella, became standard practice globally. The industrial mobilization that produced 12,275 Hellcats in just 30 months showcased American manufacturing capability at its peak. This demonstration of industrial power influenced post-war geopolitics, as nations understood that future conflicts would be won as much in factories as on battlefields. The Cold War arms race reflected this understanding. Industrial capacity became a measure of national power. For the men who flew them, Hellcats represented more than machines. They were partners in survival, reliable tools that brought pilots home when enemy fire found its mark. Veterans spoke of their Hellcats with affection that transcended mere appreciation of technology. These aircraft had saved their lives, protected their wingmen, and helped end the war that had consumed years of their youth. The Japanese pilots had laughed at the F6F Hellcat during those first intelligence briefings in September 1943. They had dismissed it as another American failure. Too heavy, too slow in turning, built by engineers who didn't understand aerial combat. Their confidence wasn't mere arrogance, but rather the result of 2 years of victories that seemed to validate their philosophy. They believed in the supremacy of the lightweight, maneuverable fighter flown by highly trained warriors. The Hellcat proved them wrong in every measurable way. It demonstrated that industrial might, systematic training, technological innovation, and pragmatic doctrine could overcome individual skill and aircraft agility. Within months, the laughter had ceased. Within a year, Japanese naval aviation had been fundamentally broken as an effective fighting force. By war's end, an entire generation of Japanese aviators had been lost, and with them, an approach to warfare that had seemed invincible. But the Hellcat's legacy extends beyond mere military statistics. It represents a moment when warfare transformed from individual combat to systematic operation, when industrial capacity became as important as battlefield tactics, when protecting warriors became as vital as arming them. The veterans who flew Hellcats and those who faced them understood this transformation in ways that shaped the rest of their lives. The Hellcat had the last word in the Pacific Air War. It always did. Not through mockery or vengeance, but through the quiet authority of superior design, industrial strength, and a philosophy that valued the lives of the warriors who flew it. The lessons learned in those desperate battles between Hellcats and Zeros continue resonating today, reminding us that victory in modern conflict requires more than courage. It demands innovation, preparation, and the wisdom to protect those who defend us. The young men who flew these machines on both sides of this conflict deserve our eternal respect and remembrance. They wrote history in the skies above the Pacific, and their legacy endures in every lesson we've learned about aviation, warfare, and the price of freedom.